welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and today we're picking up where Friends Pitching Fantasy left off. You know, we had our big what should we read next kind of discussion. 2 books came out on top. The next one, of course, on our reading schedule was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, and we've read it, and we're here today to talk about it. Isn't that right, Dylan?
That's exactly right, Charles. I couldn't have said it better myself. We read a book, and we're here to talk about the book that we read. So,
Yes.
It's one of the 2 books that came out on top in our Friends Pitching Fantasy episode. It's a little outside of our typical reads because it falls into more of a fantasy romance category. Charles, we typically dive into more of the epic fantasy, the high fantasy, the grimdark fantasy, and it was time, Charles. It was time for you and me, of all people, to discuss fantasy romance and our takes on it. I think some folks out there, based on our social media feedback, are excited to hear what might be a little bit different take, some different perspectives than the typical podcast that focuses on A Court of Thorns and Roses, the massively popular first book of a massively popular series from #1 New York Times bestseller, Sarah J. Maas.
That's right. Of all of the romantic fantasies to dive into, you know, I think we picked a very safe pool to dive in here with Court of Thorns and Roses, massively popular, you know, huge amount of, you know, traffic and sales and conversation around these books. A lot of love for these books. It was interesting when we pitched them. It wasn't like the most requested by like our social media audience, but I do think there was that niche group that was like, ooh, you guys don't normally talk about this. This could be something interesting to dive into, and we couldn't agree more. And that's why we're here. And, you know, we talked about it a little bit through text as we were going through reading it, but we haven't really dived into it yet. I know your first impressions, but maybe we should be sharing them with the audience. What do you say?
Yeah, let's get into those before we get into the spoiler section. I will say, Charles, on the point of the social media stuff, it might not have won the votes once we start tallying up Twitter polls and stuff like that. But I think if you just looked at comments, I would say it would appear that this is the one that folks were most interested in.
Said.
I think that, so I think that the more vocal side of the fan base, rather than necessarily the folks scrolling by and just like who happen to be following us, because we've accumulated a fan base primarily focused on other subgenres of fantasy, I think it makes sense that most of our following kind of click the stuff they're used to. But the folks who want to reach out and talk, they want to hear us talk about this. And, of course, our first impressions of this book, like you said, Charles. And I have a very positive first impression to share with you and our listeners because it is a very entertaining read, I would say. It totally makes sense why these have had the huge appeal that they have. The book, I mean, the pacing is awesome. You gotta give it that. It's like there are things that happen in terms of like the story really getting going. I mean, even getting to the stuff, like I think it's fair to talk about, it's back of the book stuff, so I don't consider that spoilers. Like her getting taken to the fairy court and all that kind of stuff. It's like there's all sorts of books that would just like dilly-dally for the first 100 pages before things really get going or whatever. Like Sarah J. Maas, she has a gift for getting the story to move along and getting us to places we need to be to tell an entertaining story. And it's like every chapter something is happening that is fun and entertaining and often and sometimes spicy. So Charles,
Ooh,
I
indeed.
yeah, I really enjoyed the book, primarily for those aspects, but of course for other aspects as well. How about you, Charles?
I would agree. The thing that there's a few things that I knew, not many things going into this. One was that it was a romance story. So immediately when things happen, I'm like, ooh, they're going to get together. So that was, a piece of that. Or maybe they won't. Who knows? It's still the spoiler free section. There's all kinds of exciting, well, they won't, they tension here. But you just know going into it that something steamy is going to happen. So every time they talk to each other, you're like, is this the moment? Are we going to get the steam? So that was kind of a fun experience. But to your point, the pacing in a genre, and I'm talking about the fantasy genre at large, pacing can be one of the hardest things to get down. There's so much need to explore your world, explore your characters, explore the politics, have people talking in rooms, debating decisions, weighing decisions, this and that. And certainly all of that is in here, but I agree with you 100%, Dylan. The pacing was first rate, really very good, and that makes it more entertaining, one, and number two, I feel like it makes it more accessible as well, which is why
Yeah.
it's had this mainstream success. The accessibility of this book, I think, is very, very high, while not being I'm going to say, while not being dumb. And what I mean by not being dumb, it's not like some stupid, fluffy romance story that uses little words and doesn't challenge you at all. It's not like that. It's a serious work of, fiction, and it's not it's not written at a preschool level or anything, but through the fact of having this
Charles,
engaging
where are all
storyline.
these books written at preschool levels?
You know what I'm talking
Charles, you've
about,
read
man.
one romance book now, so I
But
think what you're trying to get at is this idea of what you were talking about when I first pitched it, which is is this another Twilight? And Twilight was geared toward
or
a
even
younger
50 Shades of
audience,
Grey, which
or
it
50
gets
Shades of Grey,
I
sure.
don't know how well Twilight
prose
was
is
written or
not-
not written. I don't know. I've never read it.
Right. The prose of those books, it gets lambasted oftentimes because it's not very strong, and I think that those books serve the purpose they serve very well. But this book, and it's something that I got into in my pitch, which is based a lot on what my girlfriend, who's a huge fan of the series, was saying, is even if this book was not very focused on the spicy romance, it would still be a really interesting, entertaining fantasy book. And I think it's got a lot going for it in that sense, because people like you and me who maybe wouldn't flock to a book that's just pure romance and sacrificing quality of prose and sacrificing character building and sacrificing world building, all this stuff. It doesn't sacrifice that. In fact, it finds a way to include all of that in a way that someone like you or me, who's used to reading fantasy books that aren't necessarily romance, can sink our teeth into those aspects of it, and we can also appreciate the romance parts. It's not leaning on if you're not completely enraptured by the romance, you're not going to enjoy it at all. It's not leaning on that. It's got all these other things that are enjoyable. And of course, the romance is well written. So we did, at least I did, and I'm sure it sounds like you did too, enjoy the romance aspects of it.
I did enjoy it, but I also, as much as this is touted as a romance book, I think other things kind of take the spotlight. The character work in here is very good. There is certainly a lot of action and a lot of stakes as well, really interesting stakes that we'll get into in the spoiler version. But I think that's what helps it kind of break out from what could be for lack of a word, a trashy romance novel, which it's not at all. It is a fantasy story worthy of its success and praise beyond just the fact that it's a good romance. There's a lot of other stuff in here that I like very well, but I don't want to get into that without giving our spoiler disclaimer, of course. I would just say, hey, anyone in the fantasy genre looking to dabble in romance fantasy, like, this is a great pick. I would say if you're trying to recommend fantasy to like a significant other, or, you know, a friend that maybe is on the fringe of fantasy and not really ready to dive into something crazy like a Sanderson Chihuahua Killer, this is a very approachable read as well. You can't really go wrong with it. So that's just all I wanted to take away in the spoiler-free version segment.
Definitely. That word you used earlier, the accessibility of the book, it makes it so easy to recommend. And even, like you said, the Sanderson books, which are in themselves New York Times bestsellers, but those humongous 1,000+ page books that we affectionately call Chihuahua Killers, even though so many people love them, I find myself reticent to recommend someone pick up The Way of Kings, despite how much I love it, because how do you recommend a 1,000+ page book to someone who's like not
part one of like a ongoing 1,000+ page book series? Like, talk about a literal barrier to entry, am I right? Those things take a whole shelf. Like, that's a solid wall right there, those 4 books all together.
That they are. And Sarah J. Maas comes in with this it's 400+ page book, I think. Like, I Kindled it, so I wasn't trying that super closely, but I think that's it. So it's got some substance to it, but it moves so quickly. Like, it's such an easy read. We did that episode a while back that was like top fantasy books to take on vacation, which I think this would be a perfect fit for. I read it on vacation, and I was like, this is exactly what you need. It's got stuff to really lose yourself into, but it's not like this really hard to read. Like, it's got the magic of, I feel like I'm in this world without having to bombard you with all of this world building to make you feel that way in some 1,000-page epic. So,
and what's nice is it is book 1 of a 5-book series, but the story's very contained. Like, I feel pretty good about reading like this one book that I got a full experience. You know, sometimes in fantasy it's not so simple. It's like, okay, well, Harry Potter has to go back to school like 6 more times. I'm like, you know, it's like, it's for 6 more years. But no, you can read this, and if you liked it, but your vacation's over and you don't want to pick up another one, you'll get the experience. But if you want it to keep going, if you're looking for that experience, the potential is there. So I think that's a really interesting piece about it as well. That, again, lends to its accessibility. Its mass appeal potential is being able to give you that both experiences, whichever, depending on what you're looking for.
For sure. The phrase that we like to use, and one I've heard from folks in the publishing industry, is standalone with sequel potential. And that's what they usually are looking for in a book 1 when a new author writes one. I mean, Sarah J. Maas obviously has this huge fan base that will consume whatever she puts out there. You see those comments are like, I would read her grocery list. It's like, I do think people would buy that if she released it. So I don't think she's worried about
plump
like
tomatoes.
Right. I don't think she's worried about not being able to write a sequel to this or anything like that, but she still gives her readers like the benefit of a book that tells a complete story. So that's probably one of the last things that's good to get into before we get into the spoiler section. Just us saying, because I always want to know that. I'm like, if I read this book 1, like, am I gonna feel like I have to read the next book in order to even like get a complete story? I want to feel like I have to read the next book, but I want to feel that way because I enjoyed the first so much that I just can't wait. This definitely makes lots of people feel that way, that they can't wait to read the next one, but it does tell a complete story. So like Charles said, take on your vacation, and if vacation's over and book's over, you don't necessarily have to read the next one, or maybe you're waiting for your next vacation to grab book 2, because you will get a full story with a lot left over to dive into in future books. But we have a lot less left to dive into ourselves in this
yeah.
episode, because we've got to get into the deep depths of spoiler territory.
The
and
juicy details, my friend.
Oh, yeah. The juicy details are coming. So, those of you who've not yet read A Court of Thorns and Roses, who are not among the 1.67 million, whatever it is, people that have rated it on Goodreads alone, you folks, you can join the horde that we are now a part of and go get yourself a copy, read it, come back here. But we're going to get into spoilers from here on out. Spoilers for A Court of Thorns and Roses, just book 1 here. Charles and I have not yet read beyond this, so yeah, we couldn't spoil anything for you even if we wanted to. But
True.
We will, yes. Book 1 is entirely fair game from here on out. But yeah, if you don't want to get those spoilers, now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones.
Well said, Dylan. And now here we are, in the spoiler-free section. I think the first thing that I really wanted to kind of get into, we talked about the accessibility and like the pacing of it, right? The fast pacing. And one of my favorite parts of this whole story was the beginning, where she's hunting in the woods and she's hunting the deer, and then the wolf shows up. Like, very strong start to this book and very strong introduction to our main character, Feyre, who I have a lot of opinions about, and I'm sure you do too.
Yeah, I definitely do. But yeah, we start with that scene. It gave me real Hunger Games vibes.
Yeah.
And there were a couple parts of the book that gave me Hunger Games vibes.
Yeah.
And yeah, but it's a completely different story. It's just a more like very zoomed out, like, this person is a hunter who's had to struggle to get by in this situation, but she's about to experience some like totally lavish world. Like that was very Hunger Games, got the bow and arrow and the whole deal. So Feyre, though, very different character from Katniss. I would say it was a lot more personality than Katniss had. But we get the introduction of her hunting. She kills this wolf. She even kind of has in her head maybe it's a fairy, but
Right.
she doesn't know. And she ends up killing it. And yeah, we pretty much get a pretty typical, although abbreviated compared to some other books version of this, like, here's her day-to-day life. She's a hunter and she goes to the market and that kind of stuff. But I like how actually kind of quick we get to, like, Tamlin busts down the door in his beast form and,
Right.
like, takes her away. When that happened, I was like, yes, like, let's get this going.
I remember we kind of talked about that. That was like the first indication that this book was not going to waste our time, right? Because you could have so easily gone multiple days of them just being cold and hungry in the humble cottage, and then all of a sudden the book is, and then this giant werewolf busts the door down and screams at us, and it's end of chapter, and you're like, okay, like and I remember feeling so happy. I was like, yes, thank you for doing that, because I wasn't feeling weighed down yet. But I was only when that scene happened, I realized, like, oh, we're moving, we're clipping here. Like, thank you. Let's go to the next thing. I was entertained that full way. Like, I wasn't feeling the slowdown at all. But I think Sarah J. Maas knew, it's like, okay, the story's not about this piece. Everyone knows from the back of the book, it's about getting kidnapped or getting taken and going to fairyland. So let's go ahead and get that moving. And that whole initial first act there, I was very interested by. And it's interesting, Dylan, that you were managed to, I think the way she's able to do a lot of that and not dwell on it is she does pull from a lot of, like,
yes.
But so she has a lot of these tools in her arsenal of, like, okay, Hunger Games this, Twilight that, fantasy this, like whatever it is, right? Like, it doesn't dwell too much on building this world because it's rooted very much in a reality that we're all, like, familiar with, and, like, fantasy tropes that we're familiar with. But the way she then twists Feyre, like, you read, like, Harry Potter or something, and, like, Harry Potter's perfect and everyone likes him and he's so humble and nice, and you just insert yourself into him and you like him. And then you read Feyre and you just are constantly frustrated by her and confused by her, but yet her likability stays up and she keeps the story moving and she keeps you entertained. And I think that was a really smart choice with the character of Feyre, right? It's like we can pull on all these fantasy elements, but here's a character that's just gonna blunder through. She's gonna be strong-headed, a bit ignorant, a bit obstinate, and she's just gonna like blow through all these things in a way the reader probably never would. There were so many times I was reading Feyre making decisions and I was like, horrible choice. Like, how is it you're making the worst choice possible? But it's true to her and it keeps the story moving and fun, but you would never identify with it, like, at all.
Yeah, I kept saying to my partner, I was like, when I was reading, I was like, I'd be the most boring fantasy protagonist because all these moments where it's like, stay at home and paint and like you'll be safe. Like when the Suriel is telling her that, I would be like, okay, got it. I'm not going to leave. Like I'll hang out here. It's a real nice setup I've got. I can engage with my hobbies. And it would be the most boring book because it would be me sitting, would painting be my thing? Not necessarily. I would probably be reading or something, but, the idea of what I would do versus what Feyre would do, my story would be extremely boring. But luckily, we have Feyre as our protagonist. But you did mention, I want to double down on this. Sarah J. Maas has this understanding of the things that we as readers know. Like, this. Like, that's what you're saying about this is Hunger Games, this is like Twilight. It's like, and because of that, she can give the bare bones of a, like, life lived in poverty and she's the hunter and that kind of stuff. And she can allow us to fill in the gaps. And it's like, all that kind of stuff is just, like, beautiful understanding of reader experience and respect to the reader experience. We say that a lot of times when we talk about Sanderson, especially when it comes to something like Mistborn or Warbreaker, like this understanding and respect for reader experience. I want to say that that is one of Sarah J. Maas's greatest strengths, in my opinion, and one of the reasons why it is so accessible, like we're saying. And then you mentioned she twists it with Feyre, and I absolutely love proactive protagonists, even if they end up doing things that I would never
She's
do.
very
that
proactive,
I think are so dumb.
but
she's extremely proactive.
She's
and
like, I'm going to run into this trap and get myself killed.
Okay, well,
Full speed.
It's annoying when passive protagonists just sit there and the world moves, revolves around them in whatever way. It's like, because you have to sit in their head and just like be boring. And it's like, this is a huge criticism of like Bella from Twilight, and one of the things I think differentiates these two books, like Bella just sits there and all the characters around her do stuff. And that's, I haven't read Twilight, that's just the criticism that I'm parroting. I believe the criticism, so let me know if this is incorrect. But it's refreshing to hit on a lot of these notes that we're familiar with while having a protagonist who's very proactive be put in that kind of situation. So, yeah, Feyre, I approve of the way that she's written in that sense.
Right, and I see, like, when I look at like user reviews for A Court of Thorns and Roses, like one of the main criticisms is people frustrated with the character, and for me that's almost like a plus, because you need a character who's going to kind of stumble through a few things to keep the action going. And sure, we could, like, Sanderson would dedicate chapters and chapters of weaving in motifs that would lead to a character making a decision. But it's another thing when literally a chapter before you have these fairy creatures being like, be careful, there's creatures out there that can play tricks on your mind and attempt to lure you out. And then that night she looks out her window, it's like, that's my dad, let me run out and get to him. And like literally running out and almost gets herself killed. And I'm sure every reader in the universe is like, Feyre, what the heck are you doing? But it helps us see like how compelling some of these effects are, how, Feyre is not just going to go along to the beat of someone else's drum. She's going to be contrarian almost all of the time. And it's funny where she's like, I have to leave at any second. And then he's like, okay, you can go. And she's like, I have to go back. I have to stay. And so you're just like, oh God, Feyre, like every second you're just fighting. And that gets us to the end too, which I kind of want to save for later. But all I wanted to say about this beginning piece was, Sarah J. Maas has some writing chops, and she's got master pacing, and she's got the character work going with Feyre. So all in all, I was very impressed with the first third of this. I was impressed with the whole thing, but specifically that was what shined for me in the first third of this book.
Definitely what shined for me as well in the first third. I think that we also have to keep in mind that Feyre is 19, I believe. Yes. Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes that gets lost in the reader experience. Like we're two guys our early 30s reading this, and it's like our behaviors might be significantly different than Feyre, and that's good character building, because if Feyre were to make the decision of a 31-year-old man who grew up on Long Island, that probably is not good character writing.
Yeah, 19, but she also spent most of her life in poverty in a frozen cottage hunting for food also. So she even has that distinction separate from her sisters, where it's they still have maintain some of their nobility. They can read and write. They can do this, and I can't do any of that. So she's literally going from being completely isolated in every way to some big deal social interactions going on, and is expected to navigate that. So you can imagine how she's almost at the very beginning, she's pocketing kitchen knives under her sleeve and things like that. It's just those kind of base instincts, which can so easily be a trope, especially in a romance where it's you've got the woodsy survival girl who's borderline feral, pocketed knives and trying to run away, this and that. And then you have the noble guy and the odd couple situation. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Not too much more complicated, but a bit more, and enough that makes it sort of interesting and engaging in a lot of ways. I was always engaged and entertained and invested in the characters.
Yeah. I mean, if she grew up with how she grew up, if she just sat there and let things happen and didn't go out there and take all these risks and make all these things happen, her and her family would have been dead.
Yes.
She was in a position where she had to be like this, and she's taking that into a new world where it doesn't work anymore, where she's completely unfamiliar with what's going on around her. But it makes sense that when she's taken from her previous life and just plopped into a fairy world, that she's not going to just be oh, and now I just sit here, because that makes sense. It's no, I'm going to do the things that have always helped me get by and survive in my previous life, because people don't get out of those patterns or behaviors so easily. And she keeps doing that, and she keeps fighting everyone, like you're saying. She's fighting against Tamlin, who just right away is just this perfect gentleman. He just does everything nice and right, and he's polite. Right. I think at every turn, he pretty much, besides the kidnapping her, which in the beginning at least we think that he basically had to do that to save her. Obviously, we find out later that he just made all of that up in order to fix the curse that was on him.
Right, yeah. Right. And we could talk about Tamlin and all of that, but I see where you're going.
Well, yeah, we'll get into Tamlin, because I don't have much more to say on the whole thing. It's just that she's fighting Tamlin, and at every step of the way he appears to be doing everything as nice as possible, and he's a perfect host. Lucian, kind of a jerk at first, but still no one's doing anything bad to her besides the thing that we think that they had to do, because she killed the fairy and the treaty says so. But
right.
That's all on that.
And that's an interesting, the treaty is interesting, right? Literally day 1, she kills a wolf. Day 2, another wolf bursts down the door and says, because of the magic treaty, I'm taking you to my place. And then they go. We're not dwelling on any of it. And it's okay, you can't scrutinize too hard. You got to be along for the ride, and I'm always down for that as a reader. I'm like, okay, we're just trying to get to Fairyland as quickly as possible. You don't need to like validate that experience for me. It doesn't have to feel like super believable to get going, because it's the magic, right? It's the treaty. So because of magic, you now owe your life to me. And it's like, okay, let's go. And then we get into Fairyland, and that's when we really get to see our characters, Tamlin and Lucian, which, everyone that praises the book, like a lot of people are like heartthrobs for Tamlin. Like people are really out there, really like digging him, and I don't know. I like Tamlin as a character, but of all the characters, he was my least favorite. But I see the appeal. I find him, it's good. It's all good. He's just too noble. He's noble at every possible turn. And even when he wasn't noble, it was because he was being so noble. He had to be not noble, and you're like, oh, come on, man. Like, let's keep it he ended up getting a perfectly squeaky clean record at the end. And you're like, well, that's a good old Tamlin for you. So noble.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that you could say is not squeaky about him and how he behaved. Like he did kidnap her when he didn't have to. Did he have to break this curse and save it's Prythian?
Yeah. Prythian.
Right?
Yeah. We'll go with Prythian.
Either way. Yeah, we'll go with Prythian. There's an N in there, right? Yeah, Prythian.
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 Prythian. Prythian.
Prythian. We got it.
Anyway, just because we keep saying Fairyland, and I feel like we're gonna get some like there's huge. I don't know what they call themselves, moss heads, not moss holes. They. It's like people from Massachusetts. People call them massholes. Charles, you're of Massachusettsian heritage, but
yes, I'm a direct descendant.
Right. So we'll call them moss heads. I don't want to insult them by calling it Fairyland. It's Prythian, and we are in the Spring Court.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
he's the High Lord of the Spring Court.
He is the High Lord. So I got totally distracted by this whole thing. What point was I? Oh, the only thing that's not squeaky clean about him would be that he did have to save all of Prythian, so he kind of had to kidnap her and do all of that for the greater good. But then he even kind of goes back on that. He's like, I love you so much and I care about you so much. Obviously, he doesn't say all of this explicitly, but he's like, that you should leave and I'll doom the entire world just for you.
Yeah.
And I don't know, kind of both of those things are bad, which
right.
He does some, but it's definitely the way he's painted is so noble and so the idealized man, and everything he does is the perfect romantic partner, and in that way he gets robbed of some complexity, but also
even Amarantha desires him, so that it's he's hot stuff, right? No doubt about it.
Oh yeah,
and they have a whole ceremony where he gets all the fairy magic and then gets his pick of all the fairy ladies, and they all will willingly, be with him, and they create all of the magic. This is the guy. This is about as big as it gets.
Oh yeah, this is definitely the guy. I think that it makes sense from the perspective of we're trying to write this romance that does have a very clear self-insert aspect to it, even if Feyre isn't exactly how a lot of people are, her behaviors aren't what they would behave in. The reader base that she's going after is supposed to put themselves in the position of Feyre falling for Tamlin. Like that is the romance aspect of it. And Charles, I don't know if you quite got there where you felt like you were Feyre falling in love with Tamlin. It sounds like you did not. But I think him being so noble and
Sure. I
idealized
see
in
the
that way, it's
appeal,
all
like,
part of what she's doing, you know?
exactly. Yeah. I mean, the whole like middle act here, the whole middle third, where they're in Prithian, and
Prithian.
Prithian. And when they're in Prithian, in the Spring Court, of which Tamlin is the High Lord, and you know,
Nailing it.
from when they get there, and it starts off a little rocky, and there's this like communication barrier. There's this approachability barrier. Lucian is being a little extra teasing and this and that, and then watching that like slowly erode was like this whole like slow burn of their relationship I thought was very good, because everyone says, oh, it's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, this and that, and it's like kind of like it, but I feel like the relationship is a little bit different, and I was along for the ride because Sarah J. Maas, although she keeps the pace moving, right, and she doesn't dwell too much on because magic and this and that, at least she developed where it counted. One with her main character, and I'd say the other one is with this relationship. She brought out these key attributes both in Tamlin and in Feyre that would make them like a compatible match. Because for me, like when I think about things, I'm like, okay, you have this immortal fairy lord of the Spring Court. Why would he care at all about some random 19-year-old? Just like,
well, we should. I do think it's kind of. We'll get into the age gap a little bit, but go forward. And
right, it's
we'll backtrack to it.
At least there's a justification for it around that. Feyre has also had to sacrifice for the greater good of the people in her world, her family. She also is willing to, be compassionate for those that are suffering. There was a great scene where Tamlin brings home that fairy that was just absolutely butchered, and Feyre was there to help. She took my
wings, Charles.
She took my wings. She took my wings. Yeah, so like that was another very well written, like heavy scene, and to me that was part of their like budding romance. They like made a huge connection there, and it's funny that was like a super sad and depressing, like you're not like, ooh, they're in love, but you're like, oh, they're actually connecting, and it's very serious. Like, another thing that strikes me interesting, we could talk about this later, is that this is kind of couched between young adult and this budding new genre called new adult, and just like
I mean, this isn't young adult.
No, it's not, but it was marketed that way. I would say
new adult is. Yeah, I know.
It was marketed that way. And that's the point I want to make, was it's very mature content in a lot of ways. Like, not just, in the romance, but in the brutality and the violence that we see.
Yeah.
And, people literally getting, like, limbs chopped off and dying slow, horrible, painful deaths. There's a lot of suffering and anguish, and as people are facing their mortality when they die, and it's heavy. And I like that she included those elements, because a lot of times you think that would be off-putting for a romance, right? Like, no one wants to read about bloody stumps where wings used to be and someone just rambling their final death rattles before they die and you're holding them covered in blood. Like, no one is getting romantic feelings from that. But Sarah J. Maas is like, no, this is what the people want. This is what I'm going to write. And it just works. It just works in a way that I appreciate more than a sappy, like, Lifetime romance. It's the difference.
Yeah. From the bloody stumps where that, from where that fairy's wings used to be, blossomed a beautiful new romance. Mm-hmm. And that fairy had to die for this romance.
Just one of many deaths that had to happen for this relationship to work. Right. I think like 5 people had to get killed brutally for this.
Worth it. So,
but we're at 2 right now, right? Because we're at our first guy here. What was his name? Andrus.
The wolf. Yeah.
Okay, and then we got the she took my wings guy. So that's 2 now that have had to die. We'll keep the body count going,
Right.
but we're at 2 right
We
now.
know at least 2 more are coming.
Yeah.
So
Oh, don't we?
we'll see if we'll see if we can find any more. But yeah, just to backtrack quick to the age gap that you mentioned, Charles, this does have that like classic Twilight
Yeah.
thing that like, maybe like kind of pops up in your head when you're reading it, but then you kind of like forget it and you move forward. But it does deserve some attention here. She's a 19-year-old and he is like, who knows how old, like hundreds, thousands of years old.
I don't know about
like,
thousands, because there's
hundreds?
like, oh, I was a child when, the slavery was abolished. I had nothing to do with my family's slavery and killing of people. I was a kid.
Yeah, but what's a child? We've got Alice, like, she's like,
that's true.
Oh, yeah, I'm raising 2 youngins. They're both in their 50s. And it's like, in my head, I'm like thinking of Step Brothers with Will Ferrell. And I'm like, and John C. Reilly. They're like coming over. Yeah, they're coming
home
to Tamlin's.
to John C. Reilly and Will Ferrell.
Right. That's who Alice is raising. And she brings them into Tamlin's house and they're like, oh my God, this place is huge. We're going to have so much room for activities. So, but so that's what was going on in my head. When they do cast this TV show, I would give anything for them to cast Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly as Alice's 2 like younglings that she's taking care of, who are only in their 50s.
Right.
But anyway, yeah, we've got this 19-year-old girl who's, let's say, hundreds of years old is Tamlin. So that's super creepy, right? Like, imagine if this was like a 38-year-old, like, balding man. It would be
or
like
50 or 60.
Like,
you know
sure,
what they say?
but
There's
I'm not
only
even trying to go
one
that high.
thing an
I'm just-
immortal being would want with a 19-year-old, and it's not their mature personality, okay? Is not
Right.
that. And also,
Well,
it's like,
I'm just
oh,
trying to
you
say,
took
like-
her like out of this isolated environment. You made her dependent on you. You got her trapped in
groomy.
your house. Yeah, a little groomy, a little Stockholm syndrome-y, which is in line with the Beauty and the Beast tale, by the way.
Yes.
I guess they have that in
Fair.
common as a retelling. But yeah, there's those elements in that for sure.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give a, like, still not an old person, but just, like, I'm imagining this, like, 39-year-old balding man, if he did the things that Tamlin did, it's like, what is that guy, like, trying to do with that 19-year-old? This is disgusting.
Or
But if
imagine
it's
like a Leonardo DiCaprio
like
or something,
hundreds
right?
of
like
year-
a beautiful
Sure.
movie star everyone loves, and he brings
Everyone
a
thinks it's
19-year-old to
gross.
the red carpet, and you're like, whoa.
Yeah. And it is gross. I'm not defending the Leonardo DiCaprios of the world. I think that's gross too. But I also think it's kind of gross when you think about it. It's really gross when you think hard about it. That Tamlin is hundreds of years old and like it kind of puts her in this weird isolated situation when she's 19. But it's almost like once you start getting to like immortal beings and hundreds of years old, it becomes like gibberish, like nonsense, and you just like stop even thinking about it.
Right.
Well, if it's like an accessible age, like Leonardo DiCaprio, whatever he is in his 50s, let's say, like it's something you can actually imagine yourself being, and then you think about like, oh my God, like imagine being a 50-year-old interested in 19-year-old. That's gross.
You have to make them like younger appearing. You have to make them handsome and noble. And then you also have to make them a little sparkly. That worked for Twilight, and it works for Court of Thorns and Roses too. If they sparkle, then they're good. Then they could date 19-year-olds, and it's cool. And then when you bring in the magic curse, true love, this and that, you can get.
He had to
past
do
a
it
little
for
bit
the
of
greater
too.
good.
The greater good.
He had to do it.
He's trying to
poor
save the whole
Tamlin.
Supreme Court. And that's the other thing that kind of confused me. I was like, okay, you have this woman, right? This big villain. Her name is
Amarantha.
Amarantha, right? So you have Amarantha, whose claim to fame was inviting everyone to a dinner and betraying
I know where
them
you're
all
going.
and stealing their power. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, if I play her game and I win, she'll give it all up. She'll play fair. And I'm like, why is everyone playing this girl's game? Like, she made the spell. She's not just going to give up the power. That's like the thing I didn't understand about that whole premise of, oh, this was actually a whole long con of you have to make a human person that hates fairies fall in love with you. It's like, one, that's a crazy premise to prove. The fact they even pulled it off, like find a chick that hates fairies and killed them and then is interested in Tamlin, like that's a huge success. But then it's like, okay, let's say she did say I love you. You think she was gonna, give it all up? I highly doubt it. And as we saw in the trials, she didn't give it up either until, the catch-all, which we'll get to later. I have very many opinions on that, but it's just some of those things. It's like, yeah, okay, we'll suspend our disbelief here a little bit. And I this story, it's entertaining. It's surface level in a lot of ways, and I find that's like, don't push. Like don't look at this relationship too hard. Don't start counting age. It's just a number, okay? Don't question the situation around it, and just roll with it, because it's not ultimately important to the story. It's not what's entertaining and engaging and interesting about the story. What's interesting about the story is these characters getting together and making that connection and doing things like going on dates, and like we mentioned, the she took my wings guy. But I also like the scene where they go swimming and he tells like a dirty joke or a dirty limerick or something, and Feyre laughs for the first time. Like, those are very endearing moments that I liked quite a bit. So that process of getting, and then of course the payoff with the romance, like all of that, it does, like, you don't want to scrutinize or criticize the details too hard, because we're not focusing on solidifying those details. We're just focused on telling you an entertaining, juicy story, and that's what we're doing here. As fun as it is to criticize the age gap, it's still a good relationship. There's still those good moments, like the she took my wings and when they go swimming, that I actually thought were really well written and really enjoyable.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I enjoyed the romance. It's just that every once in a while, it like pops back into your head because of some like cue, like him being like, "I was a child during that thing that happened hundreds of years ago," or whatever, and you're like, "Oh wait, yeah, this is kind of gross." And then you go on and you keep reading, because it is that, like I'm saying, it becomes, after they're hundreds of years old and immortal, but they look like they're like 20. It's like, it becomes,
and Feyre's a very mature
in
19. Okay, she's had to raise her whole family.
Sure. Like, those are like the justifications. So you start hearing that, when they start rationalizing like that, you're like, this is bad, isn't it?
She can't legally drink alcohol, but she can save all of Printhia.
Well, I don't know what it seems like the alcohol laws are not very strict in isn't it?
No, the fairy wine flows freely, for sure. Sure. And we haven't even gotten into that piece with, what is his name? Rhysand, right? The High Lord of the Night Court. And all the stuff he was doing to take advantage of Feyre. Prithian, right.
There's an N at the end.
Yeah, but is it like of Prithian? Like, are there different...
No, I think Prithian, that was what was confusing me as well.
Right.
It's like, it is, you're not just
because you are Prithian from Prithian.
Yes.
My name is Tamlin. I'm from Prithian. And I am Prithian.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
That's
I wanted to say Printhia.
From a readability standpoint, that's my one criticism for Sarah J. Maas's writing. It's like, I cannot process this Prithian as a name of a whatever is like continent or what have you.
It's fairyland.
Continent, fairyland, sure. But
missed opportunity.
I'm trying to get it. Yeah. So you were mentioning something about Reese boy.
Oh yeah, I like Reese boy. I mean, there is this questionable moment.
He's
in the
a lot
middle.
more interesting than Tamlin. We'll say
Way
that. Like, he's a lot more
and
complex.
I see, like, I'm calling this. Okay, obviously they were teasing it at the end. It's like, I don't think everything's gonna go well with Tamlin forever. I think she may go and leave and hang out with Reese for a while and come back. I think there's a budding romance going on over here too. Team Edward or Team Jacob? I think we're getting another candidate, another suitor over here.
I totally agree.
I've never read Twilight, by the way. I just know a lot of things from being... I should read it at this point.
It was so big pop culture-wise.
I'm like comparing this book against my interpretation of what I've heard of Twilight. It's like it's kind of weird, the kind of standards that this book is being compared against. It's not even anything real.
No, it's not. I think, yeah, there's a budding romance. I said to my partner right away, I was like, they might go for a tumble in the sheets, these two. Like, right when Rhys got involved. It's funny, as a character, he's kind of, to Tamlin's, like, bright and noble and blonde. Like, Rhys is the tall, dark, and handsome with the, like, bad boy side. So we do need to... we need to have her explore that probably in future books. And these like spicy romance books, it's like, I mean, how much can we really enjoy over the course of like 5 books of her like having a really stable relationship with Tamlin that's like loving and monogamous? It's like,
yeah,
at some point, right? She's gotta
like I've seen
get
True
involved with
Blood.
other
I know
people.
how it goes in Twilight. Like you gotta have the bad boy come in and tempt the main character. You know, we need that, and so Rhys fits the bill pretty darn good. I mean, I don't know where the heck do we go next? Because there's all the stuff that happened with that fairy ceremony that a lot of people on Goodreads anyway, you know, jump all over with Tamrind like being high on fairy magic and kind of jumping on poor Feyre there a little bit. And then you have that's where we meet Lucian who saves
You mean where we
Feyre.
meet Rhysand?
Yeah, we meet Rhysand. What did I say? Meets Feyre.
Lucian.
We don't meet
You said
Lucian.
Prithian?
Prithian?
A lot of things end with Prithian, Lucian.
It's very
Rhysand,
fair. It's very fairy. So we meet
Tamlin.
Rhysand
They, like,
there
all end
to
with
save her
Ns.
from being like, you know, assaulted by this group of fairies. Because she was told, that's another thing. It's like, whatever you do, stay in your room. Talk about being a boring character. I would have been like, no problem. I'll see you tomorrow.
Right,
I'm
me
going to
too.
bed. But she's like, I got to go out there for some reason. Like, and she just runs out there. And I, in my mind, was like, this is going to be like a orgy, right? Like, that's what this is going to be.
That's what I thought too.
Like it's fairyland. They're gonna regenerate all the magic. Like this is what this is. And she's gonna and he's like, don't come out. Like don't look, because he's so noble. Right? He just doesn't. He doesn't want her to see him partaking in the orgy. So, but she's like, he's up to something. I'm gonna go see. Almost getting, putting herself in crazy amounts of danger. Like some really bad things were being implied were going to happen to her while she was there. If it wasn't for Lucian stepping in, and although he presents as a bad boy, my character sheet, I have them flipped. If it wasn't for Lucian, like my notes are betraying me. I have them switched.
So I go to Prithian stepped in.
Yeah. So if it wasn't for Rhysand of Prynthian descent and from Prynthian. From Prythian, Rhysand from Prythian, and if it wasn't for him stepping in to save her, but you still have those ominous vibes, like he might not, I don't know, like right away you get the sense of these characters, and that's another Sarah J. Maas like expertise. It's like you can identify and remember characters very easily. Like Lucian has the eye, so you
just
know
not
right
their
away
names.
Like I need a little extra help, but most people can get it, no problem. Rhysand's the bad boy, and so it's easy to kind of remember who these characters are. I can't tell you how many fantasy books I've read. It's like, wait, which character is this versus this versus this? Like I'm getting a little confused.
Well, there's not that many. Is another which I consider a positive. Is like
me too.
Yeah, we don't. There's all these things that Sarah J. Maas is able to figure out. Like, hey, we actually like don't need like a huge cast of characters to tell this story, or at least like not a huge cast of characters that are all important and fleshed out. So it gives us more of a chance to really like tell this story in as like efficient a way as possible, and sometimes does that lead to these characters becoming sort of like paragons of whatever their particular thing is, right? Like Tamlin being this paragon of moral virtue and nobleness, and yes, is he a stand-in for the beast? Because like I'll say the Amarantha like spell, something I thought kind of funny, like the beast in Beauty and the Beast got turned into like a legit beast and could not be a beast. And then her thing of like, I'm going to make you like not able to use your like handsomeness and how awesome you look by putting a tiny masquerade mask over your eyes. It's like, Amarantha, like that's not making him unattractive.
Yeah.
Like maybe you should put him in like a giant metal box so she can't see his like super toned 6-pack abs. Like every
or like
time
make him
he's,
put on 50
like,
pounds or something, like lose the hair, like.
Right, make him balding, like get rid of the like long flowing blonde locks and the like strong
Change the
chiseled
pitch
jawline.
of his voice to be really unappealing.
like he just like took in some helium. Like
yeah. Give him like an
I don't know
Alvin
what
and the
her
Chipmunks
plan
kind of voice. I love you, Farrah. Or not Farrah, Farrah. Yeah, I love you so much. It's like I can't. I'm sorry, Carolyn.
I love
it's
you,
the voice.
Lucian.
yeah. It's the voice.
I love you, Prithian. So I think that it's I don't know. It's kind of funny because Alice, when there's that moment
like the
where
masquerade
Alice just like
masks, they're kind of sexy too, right? Like masquerades,
right.
Oh,
The mystery,
the allure.
masquerades have a sort of like sexy
Debaucherous
connotation to
kind
them,
of,
even
yeah.
in general. Like if you start. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of funny because it was like Alice has that moment where she goes through like all the exposition that we
But it's
have
recouched
been missing
in the
out
bias of humans against fairies because of the whole slavery thing. you know?
That's true. I mean, anyway, Alice goes through all that and she's like, and Amarantha wanted to make sure that it was like true love and they weren't just falling for his looks. So she put a tiny mask over his head, like over just his eyes, which you could see were like a beautiful glowing green, right? They're green.
Sure.
Anyway, wait,
I wasn't
totally
focusing
lost my
on
train
the
of
eyes,
thought.
if you know what I mean.
Whoa. Oh, yeah. Well, it is funny. You see the moments where it's like, you can see in the prose what differentiates this from what would be like non-romance fantasy that like happens to have romance in it. If that makes sense. Like, you can see I consider almost like a female gaze, right? Like we talk about male gaze all the time because that's super prominent in something like, let's say, a show that we really love, Game of Thrones. It's like it very clearly has a male gaze in terms of what it chooses to show and where the camera's looking and all that kind of stuff. And then this kind of seems to have the opposite and just the prose. I don't know if that's the opposite. I mean, it's just what would fit into like what I would call female gaze, where the prose emphasizes certain things that you just wouldn't emphasize in a like non-romance book. And they make sense. This is a fantasy romance, but it's like I'd highlight these things where it's like Tamlin's glorious body was honed by centuries of fighting and brutality. And just like that adjective glorious getting thrown in there might be not present in some of the other books that we read. And that's a literal quote. But there's a bunch of like Tamlin, he wore those warrior's clothes, cut close to show off his toned body. And 3 simple knives are now sheathed along his baldric, each long enough to look like it could gut me as easily as his beast's claws. It's like, you see these... right? So it's just like some of those moments, and it's funny too because I read it on Kindle, like I said, and you can see on Kindle what things get highlighted the most, and it goes to like remind you of like who are these books most for, who are what are the readers most looking for, because it's not like the critical pieces of world building that are getting highlighted. It is more like there's a one line where it's like, he smiled at me still, broadly and without restraint or hesitation. Isaac had never smiled at me like that. Isaac had never made my breath catch just a little bit. And it's like, that's like,
right.
The reader base is like, highlight, like, OMG. But it's like, like that would not be the thing that gets highlighted in some other books that we read that are less romance focused. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying it's interesting to see that pop up, and the Kindle like common highlights thing makes it kind of like more obvious, and it might be in other formats of reading.
Right, right. And it's kind of funny because you talked about if this was like the male gaze, it'd be like she breasted breastily, and like and
Her breasts
she
heaved
had
as they...
perfect hips where she could have kids if
Right.
she wanted to, but you could tell that she never had. It's like that kind of like weird.
God,
You're like,
yeah.
what are we talking
Super
about?
cringy.
Yeah, right. But and this doesn't get creepy with it at all. It's just kind of funny, like
No.
reading books from different perspectives for different perspectives than the one you necessarily like identify with. So for me, I'm reading this and I'm reminded of like the Lifetime movies that someone like my mother would watches and loves, where it's like, ooh, I'm a girl from the country and my car breaks down and someone comes and helps me and he's like super chiseled and super nice and he's like, oh, let me take you to my castle. Did I mention I'm a prince and I love my family? and like, there's these lines. I forget, where's the quote in the book, but it was something like, you've spent so much time taking care of others. Have you ever stopped to like, has anyone ever appreciated you? And it's like, oh, okay. Like I could see the appeal here. I could see some target demos being reached out to with some of these lines. And it's great. And I was able to be entertained and moved by it as well. It's certainly not like I was looking at that and being like, nope, not for me. Like some of those lines are truly spicy, and it's interesting to get that other perspective. And I think in a genre like fantasy, it's important to have a lot of those different perspectives too, because we're always trying to like explore humanity through the fantastic. So getting some of those different approaches to this like eternal love, romance, like high court kind of stuff was juicy and entertaining, and just the fact that it appealed. I was kind of like laughing at certain parts. I was like, this is kind of funny, but I'm like, I know who I would recommend this to. I know who would love it at the same time.
Wow, so is Rosemary getting a recommendation here
I don't know if this is a book you recommend to your mom, but it is certainly a book you would recommend to your significant other or maybe a coworker or something.
Can we get that in like one of the quotes on the front of the book? I don't know if this is a book you recommend to your mom, Charles from Friends Talking Fantasy
But
Podcast.
if she were to discover it on her own and read it, I think she would like it. Am I going to say, hey, Mom, read this? Probably not. Like,
that might send some mixed messages.
Yeah. There's just some things I'm not ready to, like, start bringing to my mom's attention on my own, but if someone else does, great. Like, that's fantastic. But me, I'm good. So...
I'm not going to recommend it to her either. That I don't want to send those messages myself. So
yeah, I'm sure she's aware of it. She's aware. No book makes the bestsellers list without her notice. So I'm sure she knows. But anyway, they get to the point of like it's kind of fun to read a romance from that perspective, right? And a lot of romances are typically. It's just like to read one with such mass appeal, and it just reminded me of
mass appeal.
Ooh, now we're talking. It had a lot of Maas appeal for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of people probably want to hear us talk about our reactions to the spiciness of it. Mm-hmm. I'll say that my first impression of the whole thing is if this series didn't have a reputation for like, this is such a spicy series, I'd be like, all right, there's some spice in this book, but I would not be like, oh damn, like this is the spiciest book ever. Just like this is a romance, and Sarah J. Maas does not shy away from like writing a full sex scene and things like that, where other authors might fade to black. She gets into the details, but we've seen that before from books that we would not call fantasy romance, maybe not with as much detail, but I want to give Sarah J. Maas credit. Like, these scenes don't read as like cringeworthy at all.
They're not like for lack of a better word, like a trash novel, where you just want to read like the dirty words and just where two characters having sex all the time and in explicit detail. It's not that.
Right, but not only is it not that, it's also not the other side of things where like we've read, and even relatively within, let's say, the last year or so, but we've read other books that have sex scenes in them and are more like let's say, straightforward fantasy book and not emphasizing the romance, and then like the words sometimes that they'll choose. I'm sure you know the one I'm talking about.
I know
I don't want to
exactly
say
which one you're
the book
talking
I'm
about.
criticizing, but it's yeah, though, like the word choice would be really strange and like take you out of it, and like weirdly like technical words to describe certain body parts, like that
Like vulgarity,
and
kind of in a way that kind of takes you out of it a little bit.
right. And those you can tell, they just don't feel like a sex scene written by someone with a deft hand for that. And even this author I'm talking about, I think writes really well in other aspects of their writing. But Sarah J. Maas, I don't know. They flow, and they're well written,
They do
and
flow,
I can
yeah.
see why. Because it's like you don't. If this is a book that's supposed to have these spicy aspects to it that are enjoyable for why people read spice, it's like and we ain't talking Dune here, Charles. All right,
The spice melange.
it's not that spice. It's if they're going to be enjoyable, you can't write them in ways that make people like forget their reading, or sorry, remember their reading and roll their eyes and be like, wait, what is that? Like, what is
Right.
that word?
Right.
So
I
props
agree.
to Sarah J. Maas.
And I
know
think that's
why
us
it's
coming
important.
in, what is it? Book was published in 2015. So coming in 8 years later and having this huge reputation for the whole series.
Yeah.
I was kind of surprised too. I thought the romance was, and the sex scenes were rather restrained. And I thought for sure, because everyone says this is a romance book with fairies, this and that. And I was like, wow, there's really only like one really grand sex scene, and there's a bunch of other moments, and there's a lot of budding romance and suspense, and I don't know what's the word for suspense for romance. So it's just this like budding romance, I guess you could say. The sexual tension, right? It's all there. Like there's moments where they have these like meet cute things. And it's funny because I'm reading this knowing it's a juicy romance, and all of a sudden it's like and he was super mean to me and stormed off, and I was like, but then he like, held the door, or he left paint in my room or something. I'm like, ooh, it's happening. And it's just like the anticipation of it. So I think there's some of that. And then it's like, okay, that was like a juicy sex scene, but his book's not about that. I'm sure there's like a fairy orgy, and sure there's like all this other stuff, but it's very restrained, It's
a restrained fairy orgy.
It's not a book like that I would necessarily say is smut, right? It's nowhere near that. Nowhere near it. And the romance that's in here, it's very good, but it doesn't, I think, shift the whole genre. And I think that's what Sarah J. Maas was like able to construct a best-selling novel, because she was able to pull on these genre elements. Like she pulled on the fantasy genre without being like too deep dive into fantasy, and then she's pulling on the romance without like blowing it out of the water, right? And she's pulling on Beauty and the Beast and Twilight and whatever else she may be pulling on at the time. And she constructs her story very, very well. Now, my understanding is from people that have read these stories and talked to me that it picks up quick. They're just like, trust me, starting with like book 2, your tone will change on all of this. Because I've told people, I'm kind of surprised it's not that sexy. And they're like, okay, just wait like a book and it will get way progressively more, I'm going to say erotic, but I don't know how erotic it gets. But my understanding is it only increases with books, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's what I've heard as well. I think that this book, obviously, you're in the first person point of view of Feyre the entire time. You can't have the two characters like have sex, like have sexual interactions really early in the book, because you need that sexual tension be built toward the whole time. So even if
Wasn't it like what Abraham Lincoln said, if I have 2 hours to chop a tree, I'm spending the first hour sharpening the axe, or something like that?
I don't think that was. I don't know, Charles. Maybe just don't trust everything you read on the internet. Isn't there that famous like pseudo Lincoln quote that's like, don't don't believe everything you read on the internet. Abraham Lincoln. Well,
Yeah.
maybe follow his advice in that sense.
I'm gonna Google
You
it
can take
now,
a
but
look. You
it's
can
one of
take
those
a
things where
look.
it's like,
But,
hey, if you're gonna make a really great sex scene, you need a lot of build
of
up
course.
and suspense. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, I agree with the sentiment there. And I'll also say, though, I do appreciate that Sarah J. Maas, like, went the way with her young woman protagonist where, like, she doesn't have the character. What is going on over there, Charles? You're
It
making
is
some
Abraham Lincoln.
noises.
Thank you very much. Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. Abraham Lincoln. Now, let's see if I can get a very good source on that. But that's what the internet says, and you have to trust the internet, as Abraham Lincoln also says.
That's true. And now this will be on the internet.
Sam
so
Hinkie used it. Hold on. It's the validity is in question, but I'm doing more research. As you were.
I'll fill the dead air. I'll say that I do appreciate that Sarah J. Maas had the character like not a virgin at the start of the book, just because I feel like that's a whole nother like kind of, for me, a thing I don't enjoy, the like pearl clutching around the like he took my innocence stuff that can kind of play out in all of this. Like it's a kind of like virginity is a kind of tired social construct in my opinion, and one that I appreciate that she just is like, oh yeah, she had kind of a romantic partner already. It gives her a little bit of experience. It takes away a little bit from the like potential cringe of this like grooming feeling stuff that could be playing out, and it just avoids the like pearl clutching around the social construct of virginity that to me is like I don't really want to read too much about.
Right, and that was taken care of right away at the beginning of this book too, which is like, okay, good, like let's get past that aspect.
That's how I felt.
Yeah, I agree completely. And that brings us to, I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about the end here where we are brought into they're under the mountain?
Under the mountain.
Yeah. Under the mountain, and where we, go through the trials, because I have some opinions about the trials and Amarantha's riddle. And I texted you immediately. I was like, dude, this is the worst riddle ever. This is love. Like, the answer's love. Like, before I even finished reading it, like, the first couple lines, I was like, I'm going to assume that because of the kind of book this is, that the answer is love, and let's just call it a day here and be done. And then the book ended, and you're like, oh, like, come on. Let's go.
Yeah. This is, I had the same reaction. I, like, leaned over and said to my partner, I was like, the answer to this riddle is love. And it's like some of it is just the context of the book they're reading, and the other parts are just like, I don't know, what else could it be? And the riddle's not a great riddle, even with the answer being love. Like, it's not like a good riddle. You're like, oh, like when the answer comes out, you have this like, oh, I get it. It's just like love. It doesn't make you react in that way. It's like a good riddle is like, what's black and white and red all over?
Right. Penguin in a blender.
The answer? What? It's a newspaper, Charles. It's a newspaper.
Right. Right, exactly.
Because it's red all over.
Yes, clever.
Right. So it makes you like think, oh, so I leaned over my partner. I was like, this is love. And I was like, it's either love or a newspaper. It's one of those.
Yeah. Well, there's that famous riddle where the answer's nothing, right? Where it's super long and like, oh, it's this, but also this, and also that. And the answer is very abstract. It's nothing, And you're like, oh, that is correct. And so you're like, okay, like it's going to be that kind of a riddle, So, yeah, it was fine. And then it gave me very much like the ring fell into Mount Doom, like in the movies, and all of a sudden the whole orc army just fell into nothing. You're like, all of a sudden this is all just undone in one motion. It's like, really, is that what's going to happen right now? Like, literally everything's going to be course corrected because she said the word love and, like, we're done. But what, as much as I like to criticize the riddle and that moment where everything just kind of wrapped up all nice and everything got resolved really fast without a payoff that really felt validated or earned. Again, it comes back to Sarah J. Maas's pacing and this whole thing of like, well, the story has to end. It has to end happy. So who cares that she solved the riddle, you know? But what I liked was she undercut it.
She also completed the trials though, which like if she wanted to not. And that was earned, and that was, I'm sure that's what you're about to get into.
Yes.
Like, there's a part of that trial that is very interesting from a plot perspective.
Yes.
And it's also, and leads into stuff that'll be interesting, I'm sure, in future books. And also is, like, the trial stuff feels earned.
Yes.
And she makes sacrifices to get through it. So it's like kind of Sarah J. Maas, she wants to like have her cake and eat it too, where she wants the whole trial stuff, but she also wants this like moment where she says love and everything.
Yeah, and she wants to be like, kill Tamlin, and it's like, okay, Tamlin's obviously not going to die right now. So you know.
But it was juicy.
It was juicy. I love that trial. And that's what I'm going to say. Like, she undercut it. You were exactly right, Dylan. That's exactly where I was going. She undercut that stupid riddle. Like, say end all be all, like, flip the whole story, end it on a dime, like, tool that she used. But she undercut it all by having her go through the trials, stumble through the trials. And the last trial is like, okay, literally pick up a dagger and stab this person and do that 3 times. And also the last one is Tamlin. And she does it. She stabs each person and they're like begging for their lives and praying and stuff and just straight up murders them. And then like think of how much suffering, not to mention all that time she spent, you know, drinking fairy wine and selling her soul basically, or her body anyway, to Lucian there. Or Recent. Selling her soul to selling her soul to Recent. And you know, it's like all of that could have been avoided if she just said love at the beginning when you and I were like, okay, the answer is love. But it's like, no, we have to go.
She also lacks the context of being in a Sarah J. Maas book. You know what I'm saying? Like, in her defense.
Yeah, like, I'm not saying anything like...
We knew partially because it's like, this is a Sarah J. Maas fancy romance. The answer is love. She doesn't have the privilege of that. The minute they
constructed it like you could do the trials or solve the riddle, I'm like, so she's going to solve the riddle after doing all the trials, right? And it's like, of course she is. So it's like, okay, let's not waste any more time than that developing it, you know? And I'm cool with that because what we got as she completed the trials were very interesting and exciting. And she, like, this is, again, when we talked about in the first act here, Feyre's, like, unlikability, there's also this stumbling through making every mistake, which a lot of fantasy main characters just don't do. And here she is, like, failing, and she makes this agreement with Rishon where she was told not to, but you know, she got all busted up and she needed the help, and even Lucian was like, I could have come and helped you, and she was like, I didn't know that. So now it's like a week of her life every month she's got to hang out with this guy. It's like, bro, that is brutal and hard to revoke from like a world building setup. It's like when I'm reading this as like a fantasy enthusiast who has to talk about this on a show with his friend later, I'm like, how is she gonna like have her character agree to this without undoing it somehow? It's such a huge irreparable thing, and I was feeling the stakes of that, like, whoa, she said yes to that, like those are heavy stakes. And then in the third thing where she has to kill people, I'm like, she's literally straight up killing multiple people. Like, the stakes here are so crazy. And then like they end up saving the day anyway, and it all could have been prevented, which I think adds to the weight of her choice. It's like she only figured out the riddle, and then also she figured out that Tamlin had a stone heart, which is like, okay, you could figure out the answer to the riddle was love, but you somehow
this was way harder.
Remember that the heart was stone. Like, that wasn't even on my radar. I was like, who cares? Like, I remember
like
what
two
she
lines,
said. There's still one
which was
more
good
secret.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah, it's like, there's still like one more secret that we can't tell you, so it must be holding out for her. And I was like, okay, I'll try and keep an ear out for that, but I never even was paying attention to it. And so I'm like, oh, his heart's stone? Okay. It ends up not really being a huge deal anyway. It's like, I can stab him and he can't die. And you know, I win the trials. So it's like, And then it's like, oh, but the trials didn't have a time limit, but the riddle did. And you're like, what? It's just like, wrapped up a little too pretty with the bow at the end, but it was worth it to get what we got, which was, how many times at the end did our main character Feyre be like, I killed two people, I killed two people. She must have said it like 60 times in that last chapter. She's like, oh, I get to be with Tamlin and he's so sexy, and I'm a fairy now too, by the way. It's like literally all my dreams come true. But I literally killed two people. I'm traumatized. And so it's like, that's actually, to me, very, very, very interesting. And also,
Right.
I've got to go to this guy's court once a week for the rest of 1 week a month, every month for the rest of my life, and that is also interesting. And I'm impressed that Sarah J. Maas would make those kind of really intense artistic choices for her character and for her story, because they were very brutal and intense. And that's 4 people. And then the fifth one was that character whose name she gave up to.
Oh yes, that's the fifth person who died for the relationship. To
Yes,
flourish.
Rhysand.
Claire or something.
Yeah, she gives the
What?
name to this character,
Yes,
and then Rhysand
gives the name
to Rhysand.
Claire
and then
or something.
that
Claire
person
something,
gets brutally
right?
tortured and killed.
Oh, terribly!
Which you're like, whoa, dude! Like, that's 5 people that have to die horrible deaths, torturous deaths, some more than others. Claire takes the cake, I would say, in terms of a horrible, torturous death. But none of them were pleasant, and there was at least 5 there that had to go through that, specifically directly tied to Feyre and Tamlin's relationship. So we'll see if that puts any weight on their relationship in future installments of the series, won't we, Dylan?
We definitely will, but I want to go back to what you're saying about Sarah J. Maas's interesting and I think well done choice to have Feyre's like killing of the innocent fairies go the way that it did. And I feel like we've got 2 typical ways that something like this plays out. There's the fantasy hero that's too noble to actually do
Fails
it.
the
So they
task,
step
but then solves
aside
the
and
riddle.
then they solve the riddle, right? They solve the riddle. Oh, great. I avoided killing the innocent people. Bada bing, bada boom. And she had that opportunity.
Bob's your uncle. I'm done.
she had the opportunity to do that. Like Sarah J. Maas had the opportunity to have her character do that, and she chose not to. Second, there's the way of they kill the people, but maybe they weren't so innocent after all. Or something of that nature, right? Some kind of cop-out. Or just straight up the characters like, I see I had to do that for the greater good, and I'm not traumatized by it. Like, there's some version of that. And that's also more typical than what Sarah J. Maas
Or like you
chose to
killed
do.
them, but then you solve the riddle and they come back to life.
Right,
And they're like,
sure.
we forgive you for doing that. Or we sacrifice ourselves willingly, like they're not begging for their lives and crying.
Right.
They're not little kids or like young women or something with people crying in the audience. They're like, we volunteered ourselves. Like,
Sure.
I would do it. Like, he leaned into the knife. I just held it and he leaned into it and he was like, for fairyland, and then killed himself, Like, that could have also happened. Like, how many times do we have human sacrifices in stories,
Sure.
for magic rituals all the time? It's usually some nameless, faceless person, or it's usually someone in a horror scene that's just being scooped up. So it's interesting in the setting. Like you said, it could have gone so many ways, but it went the most like horrific, brutal, like intense way for the character.
If Amarantha was truly brutal, she should have like had her work her way up on the people that she actually like interacted with, right? You start with Alice, next you go to Lucian, and then Tamlin.
Yeah.
You go Alice first. Or you just go with John C. Reilly first.
Right.
Her youngling
Then
John
Will
C.
Ferrell.
Reilly, then Will Ferrell, and then Tamlin.
Yeah.
But I think, anyway, the point I'm trying to make and how I'm trying to praise Sarah J. Maas's choice here is that those were 2 easy out templates that she could have followed. Instead, Sarah J. Maas goes away of like, no, I'm having my character actually do this, and I'm going to have my character actually have the kind of reaction that makes the most sense when someone does this. I'm going to have my character be traumatized by this, and we don't get the true Disney Beauty and the Beast happily ever after in the most like perfect sense, because we have a character that is highly like faced a lot of costs and irrevocable stuff, like you mentioned. You can't unkill the fairies. You can't unkill Claire. You
Right.
can't
And I thought maybe like there's
undo
going to be
your
this loophole where, oh, because she died, her agreement with Rescind is now null and void. But nope, she still has to like do that too. If I was her, I'd be like, I need a fairy lawyer right now because I think I am within my right to terminate this contract here. You made that deal with Feyre the human. She died, bro. I'm Feyre the fairy, which, say that 10 times fast. And you got to get this eye off my hand.
I can't even say Prithian 1 time slow. So
Yeah, well,
I'm not going to try to say that 10 times fast.
Right. So yeah, I agree. Now, and also what's interesting is all the things that she's done that deals with Rescind, the killing of these Fae. They're things that Tamlin wouldn't necessarily like or agree with too. And that's going to cause stress on their relationship because it's like every time I'm with you, I have to stare at that eye on your hand. It's freaking me out, Like there's things like that, Rescind knowingly did those things to get at Tamlin, right? But it's like that's going to weigh on their relationship. And then the kind of person that we know Feyre is, who's very caring and nurturing, is having to go to bed every day knowing that she killed 2 innocent people in cold blood, and there's no one doing that. So easily could have been undone. All these contracts could have been voided, could have been so squeaky clean, but Sarah J. Maas knows better than to treat us like that and instead give us some really juicy, complicated relationships here and also some entertaining stuff in all its like gory details and its implications with our main character's romance too. So I'm very impressed.
I'm very impressed as well, Charles. I think that I come away understanding why the hype is where it's at. And I think that's a big thing that we were coming in wondering about this experience. Because for us, it was like, we got to figure out what is all the fuss about with these books. And there was a version of this where he came in where I'm like, I don't know. I don't get it. But that's not where I'm at. I'm at a place where I'm like, oh, yeah, like it's really readable. It's really entertaining. It's got the spiciness, but not like, especially in the first book, not so much for people to be like, I don't know if I'm ready for this. She gets the foot in the door with this one. I'm sure she knocks the whole thing down by going super spicy. The next one's by that time you're already hooked. And it's got the romance. It's like a reasonably sized book, and it's got these aspects to it that are special and different and choices that Sarah J. Maas made that a lot of authors would not have made. And then, of course, all the other just plot and world building and character elements that make it a fantastic fantasy story in itself, outside of all of these romance elements that we often think about when we think about these books. So it makes total sense. These books are a natural fit for a hugely popular Maas appeal story.
Well said, Dylan. Maas appeal indeed. Always a pleasure reading new authors and new stories on the show, and this was no exception. So, A Court of Thorns and Roses, I highly recommend. And like what you said, Dylan, we knew something was up with it being a huge bestseller, the amount of attention it gets online, the fact that it has more like Goodreads ratings than all the other stories we pitched combined. It's like, okay, something's going on here. And it lived up to that. And that is like, as glowing of an endorsement as I know how to give, because her whole success precedes her in this case. So we're just piling on at this point. So
the best endorsement you gave was, I don't think that I would recommend. I don't know if this is the kind of book that I would recommend to my mom.
Not your mama's fantasy story, that's for sure.
I mean, she'd love it, but just that's a good way to get at the spicy aspects of it. But I think we've only scratched the surface of the spiciness pacing is based on what we've heard.
Will we read more? I think that's up to the response we get for this, because we got to jump ahead to Robin Hobb, Assassin's Apprentice, and we are reading all 3 books in that, because unlike Court of Thorns and Roses, Assassin's Apprentice is not really a contained story. You got to read all 3. So we're going to read all 3, and then we'll see if we end up coming back to the Court of Thorns and Roses series. I'm open to it. I'm curious to see what their reception and interest in this episode is like before we just commit to that. But I would be happy to do it.
You want to hear us talk about the rest of it? You want to convince Charles? I'm probably going to read the rest of the series anyway. I don't know if I'm going to dive right into book 2. But my general plan is I'm going to finish this series. I think, you gotta get Charles on board, though, listeners. And the way that you do that is by showing up, listening to this episode, but then sharing it with your friends and on the Court of Thorns and Roses subreddit and our fantasy subreddit, too.
Whoa, that'd be
whatever
huge.
else. Yeah. Twitter and Instagram and all of those, TikTok, which is probably the one I should have said before all of the other ones. But you know that I'm clearly out of touch. And, that's how you do it. And I think with that, Charles, I don't know if there's anything left to do, but play that sweet, sweet outro music and tell folks how to find us on some of those platforms I just mentioned.
I would agree, Dylan. Let's go ahead and get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping. Thank you all, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today and you want us to read more of the Court of Thorns and Roses series, let us know over on the socials. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than just engaging with us on social media, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do now on Spotify. It's just 2 clicks over at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and helps us so much when you do that. You can also rate and or review on Apple Podcasts. That review, you can write nice things about us, and that always puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Just listening, guys. Dylan, you presumed correctly. Big smile on my face. Thank you so much for making it all the way to the end. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.